Welcome. This panel was organized by the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, IPD, at Columbia University, and the title is Rethinking Global Inequality, Technology, Power, Public Policy, and the Role of the International Panel on Inequality. And I'll pass it over to our chair, Jayati Ghosh.
Okay, thank you so much, Gabriella. I'm sorry it's such a big hall for one of the parallel sessions, but it's great to see all of you. And it's also wonderful to be able to introduce this panel. We've got Clément Bohr from UCLA, who's going to talk about technological recessions. We've got Ignacio Gonzalez from American University, who is going to talk about monopsony, wealth, and minimum wages. And we have also Filip Miloslavljevic from Columbia, who is going to be talking about state-owned enterprises and market power. And as Gabriella mentioned, I am going to be talking about an international panel on inequality. I have to mention we really do miss the presence of Professor Stiglitz. He was involved he was the chair of the international panel that I'll be talking about, and I think he's also co-author of one of the papers here. So without further ado, we're going to try and keep this a bit more interactive, so perhaps 10 minutes up to 12 for each presentation. Thanks. Please go ahead. You want to go up? I
think I was just told to sit here
sure.
and do it.
Okay.
All right, so hello everyone. What I'll be talking about today is a recent paper of mine with Joseph Stiglitz that's called Technological Recession. Yeah, and the motivation for this is the widespread anxiety that we've sort of all lived through together over the last couple of years now related to AI and whether this is actually a technology that will be able to induce widespread labor displacement and mass unemployment. And so we wanted to take that question seriously here. You know, what does it actually take more generally to have insufficient labor displacement from a technology to actually induce a recession, and whether that is actually a realistic phenomenon in a modern day economy at all. And so we actually start out by motivating it by saying that, yes, it is very realistic. We've actually seen it, or there's a good case to be made that it's happened twice before. So what I'm showing you here is in blue and in green shaded areas, I'm highlighting the Great Depression and the Great Recession. And that's overlapping on the occupational shares of the US economy going back the past 200 years, where you see in green is the share of agricultural workers, in blue you have the manufacturing blue-collar workers, and in white you have the white-collar workers. And what you see is that the Great Depression in green and the Great Recession in blue are both at the tail ends of the structural changes away from agriculture and away from manufacturing. That's not a coincidence. So both of these times were marked by rapid technological change and increase in trade that led to huge increases in output in the agricultural and manufacturing sectors, respectively. And so when you pair that with the same time to the fact that these sectors had very inelastic demand, they were necessities, that combined to induce a lot of labor displacement in these sectors. And at the same time, where these workers were present, where for agriculture back in the 1930s was very rural, and for the Great Recession, it was the small towns that was also fairly rural. And so it was very hard to relocate and retrain and get embedded into a different sector of the economy, which meant that this labor displacement actually led to a vacuum in demand that persisted for a long time. And what these two recessions were very well known for was not just their depth, but also their persistence. How long it took to recover from these two time periods took 10 to 15 years in both cases. So in order to analyze this further, what we really wanted to get into is to just develop a very general model to see what it actually takes for technological change to create a recession. And so we're going to build on a model that's a heterogeneous agent new Keynesian model from Veronica Garay, Guido Lorenzoni, Ludwig Straub, and Ivan Werning that they produced in 2022. It's a very elegant model that just focuses on the core features of heterogeneous agent models, including both downward wage rigidities as well as the incomplete markets and credit constraints, with the one caveat that there's multiple sectors in this economy and workers are specialized in each sector. And so if they're displaced for some reason from any of these sectors, well, then they can't just immediately be absorbed and move into a job in a different sector in the economy. That takes time. So there's this one key labor market rigidity. And Guido and his co-authors introduced this model to actually analyze the COVID-19 pandemic. They were interested, if you shut down a part of the economy, how could that lead to an aggregate demand shock, a -1, and thereby create a recession? We want to look at something slightly different here, right, which is actually a permanent and positive supply shock, and how that can lead to recession through displacing workers. And so in our model, the two key features that you can actually boil it down to that really matter is the displacement intensity of the technology. That is how much labor income displacement actually happens when you do have this technological change. And that just depends on two parameters of the model: the demand elasticity for that sector that's producing these goods that's exposed to the technology, and how substitutable this technology is with the actual workers in that sector. And here you can see that actually all you really need for displacement to happen is for the demand elasticity for this output to be lower than the substitutability between the technology and the labor for that technological change. And so that's actually our first lemma in the paper. And it's a very powerful lemma in the sense that there's two deep insights from it. One is that the key factor is actually not how substitutable the technology is with labor. It's the elasticity of demand. Even if you have a very substitutable technology with labor, if you have a very elastic demand that's going to lead to a large increase in demand, even with the new technological change, you're not going to see a lot of labor displacement from it. The other thing that it also shows is that suppose you have a technology that's actually augmenting the workers instead of substituting for them and automating their jobs away. That can still lead to a lot of labor displacement if there's a significantly low enough demand elasticity. All right, so if this is a deep necessity, no matter how productive, if you get productive, whether it's from automation or augmentation, that increase in productivity is going to lead to displacement in that sector. And then the other dimension that's very important in this model is just how exposed aggregate demand is to this labor income displacement. So you have, and that's just a product of how many, what share of workers in the economy is exposed to the technology, multiplied with the share of those exposed workers that are actually liquidity constrained. That is, if they lose their income, they have to cut back on their consumption in the economy. So here I'm showing you, and let's just focus on the left graph, where I'm showing you on the x-axis, that is the displacement intensity as a function of the demand elasticity. And on the y-axis, I have this aggregate demand exposure as a function of the liquidity constraints, what share of workers are actually liquidity constrained. And this is a parameter space where I show you across these parameter combinations what is going to actually happen to aggregate output in this baseline calibrated economy. And we're going to start from the bottom left corner and work our way up, where you see that the region is actually split into 4 different regions. So in the bottom you have a full employment economy that's sort of hiding under the legend. And then you have the black line, which separates it from the technological unemployment, where an output gap starts to open up. Now, even though there's an output gap, aggregate output is still growing because of the increase in productivity. And so there's still an increase in aggregate output and income and consumption in this economy, despite there now being technological unemployment from these workers being displaced due to the technology. But then as we go further up this economic exposure ladder, up the y-axis, you see we cross the dashed line, and that's when this fall in aggregate demand from the displaced workers due to the technology actually spills over into the rest of the economy and leads to unemployment also in the rest of the economy, known as labeled as sector B. You can see that in the middle chart too. That's where you see that dark blue up in the top left corner, where you see increasing unemployment in both sectors, not just in sector A that's exposed to the technology. And then lastly, once you get up to the top right corner after the dotted line, that is when you actually have enough displacement of labor income as well as economic exposure to aggregate demand, where this type of technological shock could actually induce a recession. And so then the question is, how, if we do a serious calibration, or I really like what Elhana Helpman called it, quantitative theorizing, what does this imply for the Great Depression if we tested it on that, the Great Recession, and then today with AI? And so it turns out that for both the Great Depression and the Great Recession, if you use reasonable parameter values, you get the situation where a plausible region is in this upper right-hand corner where a technological recession is possible. But for AI, we're not there yet. So for AI, these sectors of white-collar workers still face, in general, fairly high demand elasticity, far above 1, or certainly nowhere near below 1. And also, there's less financial rigidities and liquidity constraints for these workers as they are higher income workers, which means that this region, which is the square I'm showing you here of plausible parameter values, it does not cross much into this upper right-hand threshold to induce a technological recession. The other thing I'm showing in this plot is the purple magenta line. That is the line that separates when this technological change is not increasing or decreasing aggregate output, but increasing or decreasing aggregate welfare. And there you see that it's more ambiguous, because to increase aggregate welfare, here the technological change also has a destructive effect because of the redistribution, which creates more inequality in the economy. And so there is still a case that perhaps, even though we were not going to get into a technological recession anytime soon from the AI technology, it might still lead to a decrease in welfare depending on the exact parameter calibrations. We also explore 4 different, very popularly discussed policies to manage these technological changes, and particularly AI. So here let me first list them. We have long-term unemployment insurance, we have an AI dividend or universal basic income, we have labor mobility, that is increasing that through worker retraining and relocation, and then also this idea that we're going to inhibit the development of AI or restrict its use in the economy. And so let me start with the first and the third, that is the unemployment insurance and the worker retraining and relocation support. Those are unambiguously positive for welfare in this setup, because those directly address the key frictions that induced this recession in the first place, which is the lack of income from the liquidity constrained workers. That's for the unemployment insurance. As well as the labor mobility, which is the core friction in the model. Remember, the fact that they couldn't be absorbed into the rest of the economy quickly enough after they've become displaced is what leads them to have lower demand and therefore a drop in aggregate demand in the economy. And so there's a clear positive effect from those policies. Now, the policies that have actually gotten more debate or more attention is this idea of an AI dividend or restricting AI development. And there, our analysis shows that they have more of an ambiguous effect. It's not clear how beneficial those policies are going to be. So if you take the shared technological ownership, well, if you recall in the last plot I showed you, to get a recession out of this technological change, you need to have very inelastic demand. And so what you see in this case is that, well, when you have inelastic demand is actually exactly when this policy turns out to not have much of an effect, because that is when this share of the economy actually is shrinking relative to the rest of the economy. And so there just aren't that much revenues relative to the entire economic pie to be redistributed from this one sector. And so if you have an elastic demand where you could get a lot of revenue from this sector, well, that's in the situation where we just weren't in this technological recession regime at all. And then lastly, the restricting of AI, well, that's more intuitive and straightforward, right? If you're in a situation where this would not lead to large welfare losses or a recession, well, then restricting it is just harmful, because this is a positive productivity change that's going to raise income across the economy. And so you need to be very certain that we're actually going to be displacing a lot of workers, and those workers are going to be very liquidity constrained before we can be confident that this is actually going to be beneficial rather than actually just harmful for welfare. So for the main takeaways from this, what I've very quickly talked to you guys about is that the Great Depression and the Great Recession do seem to fit this technological regime fairly well, but it's not the case, and I want to say yet, for artificial intelligence. And you could even see that in the first chart that I showed you guys, right? We were at sort of the peak of the white occupational shares in terms of the labor share in the US economy, not at the tail end of this structural transformation as we were with agriculture and manufacturing in the early 2000s and the early 1900s. But even if we're not in this recession regime yet, these policies can still be welfare improving because of distributional harm that the technology can impose on the economy. And as I also just talked to you guys about, the effectiveness of the policies are mixed, so I won't reiterate what I just said about that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Clément. It's a relief. We can sit down and relax, not tense so much about AI. Please, Ignacio, go ahead.
So, can I change slides?
Could we get yeah, there you are, I think. Could we get the Ignacio Gonzalez, Monopsony, Wealth and Minimum Wages?
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for the discussion and for including our paper. This paper is joint work with Joe and with Juan Montesino. And the paper is about monopsony power. Okay, so if you look at the literature of monopsony power, it has grown a lot in the last years, but it has been mostly a literature focus on micro studies, like for example the impact on minimum wages under monopsony power, and the macro literature that has addressed the question of monopsony power typically, okay, emphasize these three channels here. Okay, so the static wage markdown distortion. Okay, so the difference between the wedge between wages and marginal product of labor. The reallocation between firms. Okay, which, for example, if firms that have high monopsony power restrict employment, workers have to, or high productivity workers have to work in lower productivity firms, right? And that creates a sort of misallocation. And then, of course, the distributional effects of monopsony power, the fact that monopsony drives wages down, it increases returns to capital, and so on and so on. Okay. So in this paper, we are going to talk about macro and monopsony power, but emphasizing a different channel. Okay, so the channel that we are going to emphasize is one that we believe is important, has been ignored in this literature, and it operates through wealth, through changes in the valuation of wealth caused by changes in monopsony rents, and how those changes in the valuation of wealth affect investment in general equilibrium. More broadly, this paper speaks about the effects of wages in the macroeconomy, right? Like typically in standard neoclassical models, the wage cost is detrimental to investment, right? Like wages are a cost for firms, and that can have a negative effect on labor demand, and therefore on investment. And if to find positive effect of increases in wages in the economy, you have to basically look at the post-Keynesian literature, right? Like demand channels where increases in wages through high marginal propensities to consume, increase demand, and firms respond by increasing investment. Our approach is different, okay? We are going to talk about the effect of wages in the macroeconomy, but through a supply side channel, not through a post-Keynesian demand side channel. And to do that, we are going to depart from the standard Ramsey model, okay? Which, if you are not familiar or if you don't remember the Ramsey model, is just like the Solow model with endogenous savings. And we are going to add three things. We are going to add a monopsony at the aggregate level. We are going to add equity prices, so there is going to be a financial market in this economy where stocks are going to be exchanged and they have the value attached to the production of firms. And we are going to assume that the elasticity of savings is finite, okay? And that allow us to play a little bit, to relax the rigidity of the Ramsey model, of the standard Ramsey model, which in the steady state, as you might know, is characterized by a static return to capital. All right, so, okay, so these are complicated maths, but here you have a standard utility function, okay, and we are introducing wealth in the utility function, okay? So this is going to allow us to have finite elasticity of savings. It will be a key feature of the model. And then here we have the labor supply, which is endogenous, and is going to be aggregated through this CES mechanism as it is standard in the monopsony literature. Okay, This, of course, will generate a labor supply that will be internalized by the firm and the firms that have monopsony power. Okay. All right. So the problem of the firm is going to be also a standard. So we are going to have firms that maximize the shareholder value. Okay. So here, shareholder value is given by the discounted sum of dividends, which are discounted by the return to equity. And these firms, because they are monopsonistic, they internalize the labor supply coming from the household sector. So this is super standard, okay? There is nothing very new here, okay? And as you can see, this delivers a standard first order condition with respect to labor and with respect to capital. This is the demand for labor, this is the demand for capital. And as you can see, okay, the markdown here, okay, is a wedge between the wages and the marginal product of labor, okay? And this monopsony markup, sorry, this monopsony markdown, okay, it depends on the degree of substitution of labor, okay? All right, so what is the standard effect of markdown in this economy? Well, the standard effect of the markdown, the first one is the static effect. So this is the labor demand, okay? You have a markdown, okay? And the markdown, you know, in this setup, this parameter increases, means monopsony power falls, okay? And that has a positive effect on the labor demand, okay? So we know that from the standard monopsony model, okay, you reduce monopsony power and the labor demand increases, okay? Now, what we are adding to this static mechanism is a different one that relies on wealth, okay? And wealth in this model is not just capital, okay? It's capital plus the sum of, the capitalized sum of monopsony rents, okay? All the monopsony rents in the future that today are capitalized and reflected in the stock market value of the firm. So the stock market value of the firm is the sum of a productive component, which is capital, and this unproductive component, which is the value of monopsony rents. All right. So in general equilibrium, okay, in this model, the general equilibrium occurs at the intersection between, well, when the equity market clears, okay? So you have the intersection of the equity demand and the equity supply, okay? And this will pin down in equilibrium the return to equity, R star, and the value of equity wealth, okay? So here is where, you know, the intuition comes, okay? So you have this standard investment demand, okay? It's downward sloping in the return to capital, okay? So what happens when monopsony power falls? Well, monopsony power falls in partial equilibrium. It has an effect on capital. Why? Because monopsony power falls means more labor demand. Firms respond to the increase in the labor demand if there is some degree of complementarity in the production function as in standard models by also increasing investment, okay? So there is this small effect, okay, in partial equilibrium, which is present in most of the models, okay? What is less obvious, okay, is what happens in general equilibrium, okay? And this is the contribution of our model, and it changes the view about the effects of monopsony power and all the policies affecting monopsony power in general equilibrium. So when monopsony power falls, okay, the value of the rents will fall. All the value of those future rents will fall, and this will have an impact, negative impact on the stock market value of the firm, okay? So in the stock market, okay, the supply of equity is going to shift down, okay? And the equilibrium will move from A to B, okay? This equilibrium is characterized by reduced stock market wealth and lower return to capital. Now, how this fall in the return to capital affect investment? Well, the return to capital is also the cost of capital. Okay, so now firms, okay, have to satisfy a lower return. Okay, they have to pay lower dividends. Okay, and that expands investment in general equilibrium. Okay, this return to capital, okay, will cause a movement along the new investment demand. Okay, so the result is that the impact of reducing monopsony is not just this partial equilibrium effect, but it's also, okay, this general equilibrium effect. Okay. So how this framework allow us to think about policies? So of course, the first thing that comes to mind is minimum wages. Okay, typically a policy, okay, that in macro is not very popular. Even in models with monopsony power. Why? Because people in macro, they have shown, and this is a fact, that firms that have highest markdowns are also the more productive, and they pay highest wages. So the minimum wage is not popular among macroeconomists because it is not binding for the firms, okay, that enjoy the greatest monopsony power. Okay, and you are raising the minimum wage, you are not targeting the markdown of these firms, and you are hurting low productivity small firms. Okay, but in this setup, okay, in this setup, the effect is different. Okay, if we think about the effect of the minimum wage on the macroeconomy, we need to use again the channel on investment. Okay. And then we have two effects, okay? We have the static effect, okay, represented by this parameter in the model, okay, which basically does the same that we were doing before in partial equilibrium. The monopsony rent is decreased through the increase in minimum wages, labor demand increases, and that increases investment. Okay, that effect is typically small. But now, okay, you have this general equilibrium effect, which is positive, because despite that we have a minus here, the effect of the minimum wage, the increase in the minimum wage on the return to capital is negative. So we have two negatives, okay, become a positive, okay, and the logic here is the same that we were saying before. The increase in the minimum wage is reducing monopsony wealth, okay. It is reducing the unproductive part that is reflected in the stock market and is reducing the return to capital, and that reduces the cost of capital for firms when they are making productive investments. Okay. So there is more in the paper, but I think this is enough. Sorry.
Because we do have 2 more papers, and we really wanted some discussion. So please go ahead. State-owned enterprises and market power,
Yeah, so I'll introduce it while the slides are getting set up. But initially, this is a paper with Joseph Stiglitz, the third of the session, so he's been very productive lately. We're really interested in how state-owned enterprises affect market power and when governments should think about privatizing enterprises. So there's been actually quite little attention devoted to this in the theoretical literature, to this decision on when privatization should occur. And it's primarily been an ideological decision. And so we want to kind of shed some economic theory on this paper. It's going to be quite theoretical, but I'll try and just give the main intuition of the results. And then we'll kind of provide some more in the discussion. Okay, so there's a really fast-growing literature on markups in the last few years, and it often discusses optimal policy in terms of subsidies to high markup firms. Okay, so why is that? Firms are charging high markups, they're producing too little, we want to subsidize them so that they produce more. Okay? So this is politically very difficult to implement. Subsidizing Amazon, for example, for charging more than they should is politically very unfeasible, but often when you have imperfect information, it might not be first best either. So in this paper, what we do instead is we focus on what governments typically tend to do to control market power in many economies, and that is they operate a state-owned enterprise or public utilities to provide the services themselves. And they do this to prevent concentration or discipline private firms or ensure access when you want everyone in the economy to have power supply or water supply where they might be priced out in a private market. Okay, so the body of research on privatization is quite large. However, it's mostly argued for privatization on efficiency grounds. So, for example, the World Bank has generated a substantial kind of body of literature which shows that state-owned enterprises are often less productive than counterfactual private enterprises, or after a privatization, the productivity of the enterprise tends to go up. However, if the state-owned enterprise moderated market power, then there might be a welfare trade-off between the fact that we've increased the productivity of the state-owned enterprise and the fact that we now have an industry with greater market power. So this is really the key trade-off that we're trying to model in this paper. How does the efficiency gain from privatization trade off against the higher market power? So this is going to be a framework to understand when to privatize and when that privatization is going to lower welfare because it's going to increase markups. And the converse of that is when the government should want to introduce a public option, or if there's a fully private market, when will they want to provide the services themselves? So this is kind of an interesting example. So we're really kind of thinking of developed economies in this setting. It will apply to developing economies as well, but one kind of interesting example was USPS. So in 2018, there was concerns in the United States that USPS would need to exit the parcel delivery service in a partial privatization move. That was one of the kind of policy pushes by the new Trump administration. So internally, USPS was debating how to defend against this potential privatization. And they note quite interestingly that the loss of the USPS would remove them as a price anchor in the market, or remove them as as a competitive option for all businesses and consumers. Okay. So they say that if USPS exited packages, then redacted competitors would have the ability to take exorbitant price increases in an oligopolistic fashion. So it seems that state-owned enterprises are aware of the role that they have in moderating prices in a market, and we really want to formalize this with theory. Okay. Now, how are we going to do that? There's a fairly well-established body of literature in antitrust and imperfect competition economics. So there, the primary attention has been studying horizontal mergers and when mergers are going to raise prices in an industry. Okay? And so what that literature does is they derive a sufficient condition. They say, what is the degree of synergies between two firms merging such that a profitable merger would raise welfare? Okay? If you have really large efficiency gains from a merger, then prices might actually fall after a merger. So we're going to use those tools from the antitrust literature into the state-owned enterprise question. And so how we do that is the antitrust literature, they solve for the degree of inefficiency of a state-owned enterprise. So they solve for the degree of synergies, but we're going to solve for the degree of inefficiency of a state-owned enterprise such that a privatization would increase consumer welfare. Okay? So here I have the Williamson trade-off. So after a merger, you have a reduction in quantity, so you go from point C to point F, but the costs go down from C to C prime. And we're going to do the exact same thing, where after a merger, potentially the productivity of the state-owned enterprises increases from gamma C to C. Okay, so you can do this framework in a lot of different models of competition and economics, so homogeneous good economic, differentiated goods, and so forth. I'm only going to stick to the most basic example for this presentation because it's going to show most of the intuition. And I might kind of flash the empirical exercise at the very end. So I'll skip the literature. So just one or two brief math slides. So there's going to be n minus 1 private firms and 1 state-owned enterprise. And so this state-owned enterprise is just going to be charging at marginal cost. Okay? So that's how it's going to differ from all other firms in that industry. So all of the firms will be profit maximizing, and they're going to set prices, which is PX, equal to gamma times CG, which is the state-owned enterprise's marginal cost. And it's going to be gamma times CG because this is going to represent some inefficiency costs that would disappear after a privatization. So we're going to have really standard assumptions on demand and cost, which I'm not going to go over, but they're found in any Econ 101 textbook. And there's a classic lemma, which says you only really need to focus on one firm, which is the firm being privatized. Okay? So this is true in antitrust economics as well. You really only need to focus on the firms undergoing the merger. So what's going to matter is if the state-owned enterprise, after privatization, is going to reduce its quantities or increase its quantities. That's a sufficient statistics for knowing what the quantity of the whole industry is going to, how it's going to move. Okay, so the key slide, when to privatize. So a private firm is going to reduce its output if its marginal revenue exceeds its marginal costs at pre-privatization output levels. Okay? But remember, the pre-privatization price levels are just setting at marginal cost. So we have this proposition which is going to state that you should privatize if and only if the efficiency of the firm rises by more than what's implied by the inequality that's up on the slides. Okay? So just taking the most simple example, actually let me explain. So gamma again was the inefficiency cost of the state-owned enterprise. Epsilon is just the elasticity of demand of the sector. And SG is the share that the state-owned enterprise comprises of the overall industry. So if we have SG equal to 1, that's going to be a natural monopoly where the state-owned enterprise produces all goods in that sector. So then we have epsilon on epsilon minus 1. So that's just a monopolist's markup. So if you're trying to understand whether you should privatize a state-owned enterprise which fully dominates a market, you're contrasting what is the inefficiency of that state-owned enterprise against a monopolist's markup. So fairly straightforward. It kind of shows that trade-off in one equation. But it also works for different levels of state-owned enterprise involvement, so other types of oligopolistic competition. Okay. So graphically, what that looks like is you've got the reaction firm of private firms in black, and you've got what the state-owned enterprise is doing according to the dotted line. So after privatization, we move the solid black line to one of these three private firms. So if it intersects at point A, then the private firm is going to want to produce at exactly the same quantity as the state-owned enterprise was producing. So there are cases, depending on the elasticity of demand of the sector and the inefficiency that the government produces at, where you're indifferent between having it privatized or not privatized. But we've kind of developed a set of formulas which allows you to determine, depending on the characteristics of the industry, when the privatization should occur. So we have various extensions that I'm not going to go through. They're going to be, what if you don't want the state-owned enterprise to charge at marginal cost? What if they're allowed to run at a loss? For example, if they want to maximize consumer surplus instead. And the model kind of tractably allows for those extensions as well. And the formulas change a little, but the main intuition goes through that you're contrasting the markup with the inefficiency gain. Also, when do you want to run? When do you want to run at a loss? So I kind of encourage you to see the paper if you're interested in all the extensions of that. And I'll just kind of finish with a kind of an empirical example, which was the USPS one that I brought up at the beginning. So in the United States, the USPS takes up about 30% of the parcels weighted by volume. And then you have private competitors such as USPS, FedEx, Amazon in various sectors competing with them. And we would kind of wonder what would be the effect of privatizing USPS. So here's just a simple case showing the very kind of basic framework without any heterogeneous goods or so forth, dependent on the elasticity of the industry. So there's various estimates of how inelastic parcel supplies are. If they're weakly inelastic, then you should privatize them if a private company could do things 1.57 times better than the US is currently do them. If you exclude Amazon from the model, they would need to do twice as good. Their efficiency costs would need to be twice as low. However, if possible, even more inelastic, which is kind of in line with some of the upper estimates from the empirical literature, then you would never want to privatize them. It'll always lower welfare in the industry. Okay, so there's kind of some formulas which you can take to industries that you see in the data and ask, should this industry be privatized, or should we consider stepping in as a state-owned enterprise and providing these goods ourselves? Okay, so I won't go through. You can have regional heterogeneity in shipping costs and how it affects regional, rural Americans versus urban Americans and so forth, but I'll just skip straight to the conclusion, which says this is a framework for deriving when privatization will occur, and really the key thing that you need to know is how inefficient is the state-owned enterprise relative to a counterfactual private firm, given the characteristics of the industry, like the demand and how much the state-owned enterprise takes up of it. So I'll end at that. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Can you hand that back? Thank you very much. That was exactly on time as well. Okay, I'm going to go on a completely different level, actually. We've had some very interesting theoretical pieces. Could we have, perfect, thank you. Which are looking at the theoretical implications of inequality and of state-owned enterprises. This is very empirical, but this is also very much following on Professor Stiglitz's work in the sense that this is the report that was presented to the South African presidency of the G20, which was a committee chaired by Professor Stiglitz, and I had the honor of serving on it as well. No, am I going this way? Yeah. So, I mean, some of the results are very, very obvious. That we heard in the earlier session, the presidential address, Professor Helpman pointing out that global inequality fell in the last 2 decades. But this, we have to remember, is largely due to China. And if you exclude China, you do not get much of a decline, even if with India included and so on. And it still remains very high. The Gini coefficient is around 0.61. About more than 4/5 of all the countries in the world have high income inequality, and these account for more than 9/10 of the world's population. Wealth inequality is even worse. It's much higher, more extreme, and it has grown more rapidly, so that the richest 1% captured more than 2/5 of all new wealth since 2000, whereas the bottom half of the global population captured only 1%. The other striking feature, I think, is this movement between public and private wealth. And as you can see, private wealth has absolutely zoomed, while public wealth has remained largely stagnant. And some of this is not an accident. This is really, if you like, it's a transfer of wealth from public to private over time. Also because private wealth has been protected through all the financial crises, and extreme wealth has been more protected. Not normal household wealth, but large corporate wealth and large rich wealth has been protected through financial crises, and the strategies of privatization, etc., that have been talked about have also contributed. What you also find is a reversal in terms of the share of national income for labor and capital, particularly around the turn of the century, so that, basically the share of national income rose globally, but also in more than half of countries, which represent about 3/4 of the global population. We also have to remember that capital income goes to only 15% of the world. They are the ones who own capital in any form. But even within the incomes from capital, there's much greater concentration. The largest corporations take a greater share. Within that, multinationals take a greater share. Within that, US multinationals dominate in profitability. We find the markup increasing from 15% above costs in 1980 to 60% above costs in 2016. And the share of larger multinationals rising from 4% in 1975 to 18% in 2019. There are also intersectional inequalities. I think everybody knows about them. There are all kinds of issues of class, race, gender, and there are dimensions of inequality, health, education, and so on, which I will not... I'm sure everyone here recognizes them, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But the conclusion we came to as a result of this investigation is that we are actually experiencing an inequality emergency. And it's an emergency not only because of the extreme inequalities we are observing, but because it actually deeply undermines democracy. And we have seen how this works in terms of polarization, in terms of more fragility of lives, in terms of the kinds of negative political forces that emerge. But also, there is a process in which very large wealth also brings very large power. And that means the ability to regulate laws, regulations, and public policies that reinforce the inequality, give a kind of forward momentum to it. So it's not just rent-seeking behavior, which I think was kind of referred to earlier, but also, broadly speaking, the ability to change the entire regulatory framework in ways that would further advance inequality. It's also bad for economic growth because it constrains mass consumption, reduces economies of scale, and there is a whole range of ways in which it impacts growth, which I think are actually well known here, so I'm not going to pursue those. We find a number of drivers. There are the broader drivers, like structural changes of technology, demography, public policies, laws, rules, regulations. I think we emphasize that this is really the dominant thing, such as the deregulation of labor markets and the reduced bargaining power of labor because of restricting trade unions, the reduced regulations of businesses, and the fact that states do not really curb monopoly power in the same way, and they typically insist on the legal primacy of shareholders rather than other stakeholders in the economy. Much less progressive taxation. Effective tax rates on large corporations and richest individuals have fallen dramatically, and there's an increasing reliance on regressive taxes, privatization of education, financial market liberalization, I think, is a very, very major element that reappears in many of the drivers as well. And it is associated with privatization of essential services and state-owned enterprises, energy, water, transport, education, health, which also introduce the financial intermediaries for those who have the inability to repay or to pay for those basic services. The issue of access, which I think you touched on, is a very critical one here in terms of state-owned enterprises, because state-owned enterprises are often deemed inefficient because they cross-subsidized in order to reach underserved categories, other regions, populations, and so on. It's also, we've seen privatization that was associated with greater wealth inequality, and all of this didn't just mean a massive expansion of financial wealth, but it has actually protected it through crises, as I mentioned earlier. Employment is not seen as the most important policy goal, so forget about good quality employment. Any employment is, employment is seen as a fallout of other economic processes, and the policy goal is always expanding the economy, increasing GDP. Part of this also means that the interests of small, micro, and medium enterprises have really been subordinated to those of large capital and multinational capital in particular. The international rules and institutions have played a very important role in this, and economically powerful governments have used their power to shape them in their favor. They have a disproportionate role in the international financial institutions. There are de facto power imbalances in places like the WTO and so on. Austerity typically is imposed much more on developing countries by the IFIs. We have seen the double standards repeatedly over the last 2 decades. There is a tendency of the architecture itself to promote, if you like, water defying gravity in terms of financial flows going from south to north. Net financial flows have been going from south to north now for 3 decades, which is not a small period of time. And of course, associated with repeated financial crises and the kinds of global trade rules, the abandonment of the earlier system doesn't necessarily mean that it has allowed all the developing countries to do the things they would otherwise want to do. We continue to specialize largely in primary production with limited ability to enter higher value activities. So our report concluded that reducing inequality requires changing the rules of the game in a whole range of ways, improving access to knowledge, basic needs, food, medicine, digital technology, enhancing competition, reining in corporate concentration, particularly rewriting intellectual property rules, and a range of other issues that we have talked about in greater detail, as well as new models for trade cooperation and industrial strategy in a world where multilateralism is becoming more difficult, perhaps through new coalitions and partnership arrangements, and redesigned investment and economic partnership agreements away from corporate-friendly to people-friendly designs. This also involves a significant reconsideration of the government's relationship with the private sector within countries. There's a whole range of other policies. I think everyone here knows many of these things. But one of our primary conclusions was that for this to become something that is very much on the policy agenda, we really do need to have an international panel on inequality, similar to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which played a huge role in bringing climate change to the public awareness and making it part of the policy agenda. So we are thinking of a technical body centered on data and policy relevant analysis. It's not about advocacy, it's really about providing an independent, objective assessment of knowledge on inequality. So it's not going to do new research, it will monitor existing research and assess the gaps in knowledge and in data, producing periodic policy relevant assessments on the drivers that I meant. Well, first of all, on the extent, how you measure it, which kinds of measures are valid, what are the impacts, what are the drivers of both income and wealth, and their relationship with other kinds of inequality, identify the processes and trends, and on the basis of this, make recommendations on the need for further research that would enable the public to demand specific policies. So the role of this panel, which I do believe is a necessary condition for bringing about change. It's obviously nowhere near sufficient. It's nowhere near even the first step, but it is a necessary condition because we need that kind of knowledge to persuade the public and people at large to push their governments to make the kinds of policy changes that are essential to reduce inequality. Let me stop here and we get some time for discussion. Thank you. Okay, so does anybody have a question? Yes, please, go ahead. There you are. Yeah. And if you could give your name.
Yes, hello, I'm Andrew from LSE, and I have a question for Philip. First off, I want to say I really like the model. I think it's very interesting, and I think it will be a perfect fit for college books. I can already see people doing examples on their tests. But aside from that, I wondered if the model could be used as well to explain if deprivatizing a firm actually makes sense. So to make it a government firm, actually. And one of the projects that happened in America that came to mind was in the city of Chattanooga in Tennessee, where they made fiber optics a public good. And I know that's a project, and that's not a firm, but still, could it be also used for these examples?
Can we take a bunch of questions and then, yeah, you could, yeah, just behind, yes, just behind, yeah.
Hi, it's a question for Clement. So I was wondering if in your model there is a monopoly power of AI firms in this case, in which case there could be an additional reason to seize their wealth and have them as a state-owned enterprise.
Are there any other questions for giving? Yes, over here. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Nenad from A-Node Institute in Rome. I have a question for Ignacio. So you touched up on the minimum wage system. The second most popular method in solving monopsony are subsidies. So I have a question whether this channel exists when we have a system like earned income tax credits in the US. So because the welfare gain, the efficiency gain from the minimum wages are not that high, as we know from macro labor literature, would this channel still exist with subsidies and not minimum wage?
And there was a gentleman at the back there, yes.
Hello, I'm Andres from Universidad del Cauca. I have a question for any of you three, because I've heard presentations on many instruments to evaluate inequality, but mostly from neoclassical tools. So we have like monopsony, we have like privatization, and now we have like this normative perspective on what inequality is and its effects. So my question is, are you aware of any theoretical tools or mechanisms to actually like find like some intersection between this normative analysis and your proposals, like in terms of implementation of policies for this purpose?
Okay, I don't see any more questions, so maybe I can hand it back to all of you. And can I add a question of my own, which is, it's a bit of a tough knot, and I don't expect you to immediately answer it. But underlying all of this is a basic notion of efficiency. And I'm wondering whether it's always a useful one when we're thinking about particularly public delivery in certain areas. Yeah?
Sure. So first, thank you for your first question. So actually, nationalization is very kind of easy to handle in this framework. It's much more easy to handle than, for example, introducing a totally new firm into an industry that doesn't exist, because you don't know the productivity of that firm, what it would be. With nationalization, at least you can observe a currently private firm and how it operates, and so you can have some formulas for how that productivity could potentially change and whether it would still be worthwhile. So just short answer is yes, like the framework does handle it very easily. The much more kind of difficult question is Jayadi's one, which is we're really focusing on efficiency, but we don't think efficiency should be the bottom line. So, for example, when mergers are being proposed, they often use this as a first tool to screen which mergers are potentially problematic. After that, they're litigated, and they kind of go through various stages of, let's look at what the environmental implications of this merger will be. Let's look at what all these kind of different implications will be. So the first thing I'll say is we see it kind of as a first stage to identify problematic privatizations, and then that can kind of be investigated further. But it is important to know that the inefficiency cost is not necessarily inefficient in a macroeconomic sense. So for example, state-owned enterprises often have higher public service wages than private firms. In that case, that would look like an inefficiency cost in a partial equilibrium lens, but in general equilibrium, it's just a transfer from the owners of the firm to the workers of the firm. So you definitely don't want to kind of take the formula as gospel and say, the formula says you should privatize, therefore privatize, but we think it's kind of a very useful first screening, because there's currently a really kind of not much theory on when you should do it, when you shouldn't. So, thank you.
All right, so I believe the question was about monopoly power in our model, and no, we do not embed any monopoly power in this model to talk about the markups and the profits that could come from that. We see the model that we propose as sort of making the foundational building blocks that then other people can build on, and certainly that is a very interesting avenue to explore. But I do want to note the caveat, which I mentioned at the end, which is that where you saw these types of technological induced recessions happen before, was a time, if you look at the agricultural share of output was very small or getting very small at that point, or the manufacturing sector is very small at that point, right? So even if there are large markups in that industry, it's not going to be enough to inhibit the type of redistributional gains you'd want to get to generate enough tax revenue to support the rest of the economy from that. You could see an intermediate case right now where it could be beneficial from a welfare perspective, but not from the recession perspective. And as I showed, from a welfare perspective already, it's very ambiguous. Perhaps we already would have benefits from imposing some of these policies, including the AI dividend type of policy. And the other question about efficiency, the paper, again, that we were talking about is really about these longer run technological changes, and at these longer scales and magnitudes, whether it's perfectly optimal is really not that relevant, because the size of the changes in technology are just so large that they really trounce or overwhelm any of the marginal changes to say where the markup would drive in terms of inefficiencies. So in a short perspective, it's a very interesting proposal to include monopoly power in it and analyze that in the short run. But from these sort of larger run structural changes, I don't think it's that important.
Ignacio.
I believe your question is about the role of subsidies. Yeah, so the paper aims to be a paper of optimal policy. It's just that we are still working on the optimal policy. And the optimal policy in this paper, we believe, will look something like the following. So in our model, okay, the minimum wage destroys unproductive wealth, right? Well, in our model and in any model, but in our model, that destruction of unproductive wealth has positive aggregate effects, right, on capital and output. Now, in order to achieve that, okay, you probably need to raise the minimum wage in a way that you need to, it has to be binding, or it has to reduce the monopsony markdowns of high monopsony firms, which typically are high productive firms. So it means that if they are high productive firms, despite having high markdowns, they are paying high wages. So you need to raise the minimum wage sufficiently. Now, if the minimum wage is the only policy that you have for your policy mix, if you don't have a policy mix, if it is the only policy, then you have a problem, because you are, you want to target those firms, but this is damaging small firms that are low productive, and you don't want to destroy employment in the low productivity sector, right? So the idea that we have in mind is something that resembles what happens with the corporate tax code. Okay, you have the tax rate, okay, that allow legislation to target high profits, okay, from monopoly, from market power rents, and then you have deductions, okay, like the firms can deduct investment cost, okay, so that the tax rate does not affect investment, okay? Depending on how big the deduction is, investment will be more or less affected, okay? Our idea is here will be similar. It's like, okay, you need to increase the minimum wage, but in order to avoid hurting small, low productivity firms, you can subsidize those firms, right? Now, subsidizing low productivity firms from a political economy perspective might not be very popular, particularly in countries like the US, right? So, but you can think about, for example, smart tax reliefs mechanisms, right? Like firms pay taxes, and you can have some firms paying less taxes, okay, if the minimum wage is very binding for them, for example. Okay.
Great, thank you. And sorry we were a little beyond time, but I think it's still okay for you to get some coffee now. Thank you.